a secret meeting sets off alarms across the political and legal world. The players, Donald Trump's lawyers, and the special counsel. That meeting just wrapped up moments ago. CNN's Caitlin Polantz is outside the federal courthouse here in Washington. Caitlin, what are we learning?
Well, Dana, there is a lot of activity happening today. This meeting that there was a question of whether something like this would happen after Donald Trump received that target letter informing him and his lawyers that he was very likely to be indicted related to the 2020 election and his behavior leading up to and on January 6th. And so this is the sort of meeting that would often be an opportunity for the defense counsel before an indictment would be presented to a grand jury. And so we don't have a full readout, at least here at the courthouse yet, of exactly what's going to emerge there to affect what's going on here. But we have seen activity here, too, Dana, at the courthouse. Prosecutors have been arriving throughout the morning from the special counsel's office. We've counted at least 4. That's a fairly large amount of prosecutors to come over here to be working with the grand jury. And the grand jury, they had not been in on their regular day on Tuesday after hearing from several witnesses last week in this investigation after months and months of taking in testimony and evidence. And now the grand jury convened this morning pretty sharply around 9, and then they took a very early lunch break and were apparently waiting through the lunch hour that around 11, and now they've reconvened. And so we just need to wait and see what happens. But there's a lot of atypical patterns that are arising today over here at the federal courthouse and also clearly with the special counsel's team. And so now it is just a matter of time waiting to see exactly what happens next and what happened at that meeting as well between the special counsel's office and Donald Trump's defense lawyers.
Thank you so much for that reporting, Caitlin. And we have other members of our incredible legal team here at the table. We have former Assistant U.S. Attorney and senior CNN legal analyst, Elie Honig. He's actually in New York, but we have here CNN's Paula Reed, CNN's Laura Coates, and who's also a former federal prosecutor, and CNN's Evan Perez. Evan, in addition to what Caitlin was just reporting about what happened in that meeting, you're getting additional information.
Right. Well, we know now that the meeting has ended, and the Trump team met with Jack Smith's team, and they got no assurances that there would not be an indictment. They were not told that there is going to be an indictment. So the feeling, certainly from the Trump team, was that this meeting likely changed nothing. And so they went in, obviously, with a couple of expectations, or at least some hopes. They were hoping that they might persuade the special counsel to consider a few more things before making a final decision. Perhaps delay an indictment from today. Perhaps maybe buy the former president a few more weeks. Of course, as you know, his strategy, both legal and political, has been delay, delay, delay. It's worked for him in the past. And so certainly if you were to delay this a few more weeks, certainly it puts the Justice Department in this sort of uncomfortable position, right, where they're trying to prosecute the former president, as the Republican primary is really getting into full swing. We have a debate coming up. Certainly within the next month. We know certainly that if you do an indictment now, we're talking about a trial, you can try to delay that as much as you can. And then you're putting, the Justice Department in a position where they're prosecuting former President Biden's chief rival at the same time that voters are having their say.
Fascinating. Paula, what are you picking up?
Evan makes a good point. Look, it appears right now the former president is likely to be indicted. We know that because he has received a target letter. He's also received an invitation, which he declined, to go before the grand jury. And now his attorneys are having a meeting with the special counsel. The other people who have been under scrutiny in this case, at that level, people like Rudy Giuliani, they're not seeing those same kinds of invitations. And what we will have to do is wait for any possible charges to see how complicated this case is. We know that the Trump team has suggested there were at least 3 statutes in that letter, because that will impact how well they're going to be able to execute the strategy of delay, delay, delay. The Mar-a-Lago documents case is complicated in that it involves classified materials, but so far, the potential charges we've seen, it's possible that they might be able to do this before the 2024 election. So it could, depending on what the possible charges are, be harder to implement this strategy. So we'll be watching.
You know, it's funny, I have on my desk, people who love meetings should never be in charge of anything, and I stand true to that. Prosecutors don't like meetings. Meetings are in the form of testimony.
Right.
Meetings are not in the civil litigation world the same as they would be in a criminal prosecution. In the civil world, when you have two parties trying to negotiate to common ground, trying to have their goals met, they're enticed by the thought of having conversations because you can maybe massage the contours of the agreement. You can decide what the penalty will be. It'll be monetary. In criminal prosecution, how do you convince prosecutors who have evidence before them, given through the grand jury subpoena power, who've asked a grand jury potentially to return an indictment? That's not really the same meeting we have in the so-called business world. And so the idea of a delay tactic of counsel who might be more accustomed to the civil litigation world really seems to be part of this. But if you're Jack Smith, if you're the prosecutors in this case, who are not beholden to a monetary penalty in the long run, but instead the views of a grand jury, you don't have to give them an opportunity to try to convince you otherwise. The evidence ought to speak for itself.
Ellie Honig, let's bring you in here. Read the tea leaves as you see them right now.
Well, Dana, these meetings are often requested by defense lawyers and often granted by prosecutors. They're typically seen as sort of a last gasp effort to try to either slow down an indictment or convince prosecutors not to bring it at all. What's really telling to me, though, is the timing here, because ordinarily, as a prosecutor, if you get a call from a defense lawyer on, let's say, a Thursday saying we'd like to come in for one of these meetings, your response is, sure, you want to come in, what, tomorrow, Monday, Tuesday? The fact that they've already done this meeting and it's 12:06 p.m. today tells me that these prosecutors feel like they are on a very short time frame and that the next action here is imminent.
And certainly, I mean, the idea that they got this target letter, they were told that he had the opportunity to present himself to the grand jury last week, and he did not avail himself of this. And then suddenly, asked for this meeting. Certainly our sources, Kristen Holmes and I and Elena Train have all heard that this was a request made by the Trump team. They asked for this and were granted the meeting at the last minute.
And Laura, how conclusive must the evidence be in a case like this to show intent?
Well, in an average case that's not under the microscope that a case like this would be, the prosecutors must be able to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. They want the grand jury, remember, different from the actual trial jury, they're talking about probable cause that a crime has occurred and this person doesn't. But in reality, it's beyond a reasonable doubt in the sense that, can I really be successful in the courtroom with this? The vote that's returned, whether it's a majority, whether it's a slim majority, whether it's unanimous, will be very, very telling. But remember, there's a reason why the lawyers for Trump want to talk to Jack Smith and the prosecutors as opposed to Donald Trump himself. In a grand jury climate, it is the defendant alone or the witness alone who can go into the room. If they have a question for the lawyers, they got to go outside and the grand jurors can ask questions. And so by the lawyers trying to have the meeting, it's likely to suggest, listen, we want to make sure that if this person would go before the grand jury, he's chosen not to, that they are protected in some way. That's for every single defendant, every single witness as well.
Go ahead.
I just one real quick thing to mention here. I think, one of the things that I find interesting is that, the Trump team certainly, I think, really believes that this is coming, right? And one indication of that is, I'm told they've already had conversations about how an arraignment or how a presentment might happen. If it were to happen, if they were to get an indictment, they already have discussed the logistics of, can it be done remotely? This court does allow remote presentments, for instance. So
they've had dry runs too, or real practice runs on indictments as well, so they know how to do it.
He's had some practice.
Yeah.
But that's interesting, right? Because it tells you that certainly the body language they're getting, they're not being told for sure that there's an indictment. Certainly they got a target letter, tells them a lot. But the fact that they're having those conversations really does tell you why they're in that position.
Systems are almost at go.
Right.
I mean, that's Ellie. As you are waiting, like the rest of us are, just like Laura, you have experience on the prosecution side of federal cases. I don't think you've prosecuted a former president. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but meaning that this is in a class of its own. But take us inside the conversations that could be happening right now.
Yeah, no former presidents on my docket, Dana. So as a prosecutor, first things first. If you intend to ask a grand jury for an indictment, what you're getting ready to do right now at this moment is present a draft indictment to the grand jury. You have your charges written out, and you have to instruct the grand jury. Here are the elements of each of the crimes, and you better get that letter perfect, because if you don't, that will be challenged down the line. The other thing that you need to start thinking about, and our reporters there at the table have talked about this, is potential logistics, because you have to think about, if we walk out of this grand jury room with a signed indictment, the first thing you're going to do is file it under seal with the judge, meaning only the judge and you prosecutors can see it. At what point do we send it over to Donald Trump's team? At what point do we unseal it and make it available to the American public? If you remember the Mar-a-Lago indictment back in June, there was a 24-hour or so lag. When Donald Trump's team knew they were indicted, we knew there was an indictment, but it remained sealed. And then the next day, Jack Smith held a press conference and unsealed that indictment. And then a couple days after that was the arraignment that Evan's talking about. If I'm Jack Smith, I want all of this happening simultaneously. If I had a time in mind, 4 o'clock, I'm making that up, I would say press conference at 4 o'clock. I would send it over, email it over to Donald Trump's team at 4 o'clock, and I would unseal it at 4 o'clock, put everyone on equal footing.